Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this MND Academy webinar. My name is Niga Hastus, and I'm the chair for this afternoon. A huge thank you to our sponsor, Zambon UK Limited. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to provide this afternoon's learning.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to come along and speak today about kind of how best to support people living with MND and their families. And obviously, as you say, I'm going to be talking about this very much from a psychological perspective. So my background, I'm a clinical psychologist, and particularly, I'm very excited that we're going to be talking about a trial that I recently co-led with Chris McDermott from the University of Sheffield in relation to psychological support for people living with MND. So yeah, it's always nice to be able to talk about the things you've been doing. So let me just kind of sort of move on. So what I'm going to be talking about, so a number of different things. I'm going to be just begin by giving a brief recap on what MND actually is. And then I'm going to talk about why it's important to provide psychological support for both those people living with MND and those affected by it. I'm also going to discuss what the nice clinical guidelines say in relation to what kind of psychological support we should be offering people and their families. And then I'm also going to talk about actually what the evidence base shows in respect to what psychological support we should be offering. And then I'm going to finish by taking you through some resources in relation to psychological support that you might find helpful and kind of can look at after this. So what is MND? So as I'm sure you're aware, so MND is an umbrella term we give to a kind of a group of neurodegenerative diseases that affect the motor neurons in the brain and the spinal cord and results in the loss of the ability to kind of move, to speak, to swallow, and to eventually breathe. And there are different variants of MND, and they're characterized by different patterns of degeneration in the upper and lower motor neurons. And the most common variant of MND is ALS, so it counts for about 60 to 70% of cases, and that's characterized by degeneration in both the upper and the lower motor neurons. So in terms of the symptoms of MND, if there's degeneration in the upper motor neurons, then a person might experience symptoms such as emotional lability, so that kind of the episodes of sudden kind of uncontrollable laughter or crying. People might experience the muscle weakness, increased muscle tone, and over active reflexes. They also, in terms of the, if there's degeneration in the lower motor neurons, then people might experience again kind of the muscle weakness, the fasciculation, so the kind of sort of the muscle twitching, rippling. They might experience things like muscle wasting, and then also things like decreased muscle tone. We also now know that up to about 50% of people living with MND without dementia experience kind of cognitive and behavioural changes of a mild dysexecutive nature, with about 15% going on to develop frontotemporal dementia. In terms of prognosis, when we think about MND, kind of people often think about Stephen Hawking, who survived with MND for 55 years, but obviously that's the exception rather than the rule. And so life expectancy is typically 2 to 4 years after diagnosis. And in terms of treatment, currently there's no cure for MND, and the UK licensed drug Riluzole kind of has a limited effect on survival. In terms of thinking about why it's important to provide psychological support to people living with MND and their families, it's important to remember that people living with MND and their families, they're faced with numerous psychological challenges, in addition to obviously the more kind of physical, social, and financial challenges. And these challenges include the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty due to variability in MND. So there's variability in terms of symptom onset, so kind of the different parts of the body being affected first. There's variability in terms of the pattern of spread, so kind of which parts of the body are affected next and in what order. And there's variability in terms of the speed of disease progression. And then obviously, so what all that variability means is that it's difficult to predict the disease course, and therefore people can feel can experience a lot of uncertainty and anxiety because of that. Another challenge is this notion of having to keep up with a series of constant changes, having to keep up with a series of cumulative losses that are in multiple domains. And this includes things like physical losses in terms of function and speech and mobility, in terms of psychological losses, so particularly those losses in terms of people's sense of their roles and their sense of identity of who they are, losses to things like their independence and their sense of dignity, losses in terms of sense of control, and particularly those losses in terms of their future hopes and dreams. And people also obviously experience social losses to their kind of sort of social network and those financial losses. And obviously the thing about those kind of sort of all of those different losses is it requires that continual psychological adjustment, which is obviously very challenging, particularly when kind of, you just start adjusting to one thing and then the next thing changes. Another challenge that's been highlighted from the research is the lack of knowledge, awareness or understanding of MND that kind of sort of people report in the general population, and that can make people feel very isolated, and can also contribute to people feeling kind of unsupported and kind of abandoned by the healthcare system. So given these many psychological challenges that people living with MND and their families kind of experience, helping people to manage their psychological well-being is really important for numerous reasons. And the first reason is because we know from systematic reviews of the prevalence of things like depression and anxiety in people living with MND and their carers, we know that the prevalence of anxiety and depression, that they're fairly common in both groups. We also know from the evidence that psychological distress is associated with numerous and kind of a range of negative outcomes in both groups. So, for example, psychological distress is associated with poorer quality of life in both people living with MND and in carers. We know that psychological distress is associated with things like an increased risk of mortality, shorter survival times, increased risk of suicide, and an increased wishes to hasten death in people living with MND. And in carers, psychological distress is associated with numerous things, including things like anticipatory grief and prolonged grief disorder. So again, another reason why it's important that we address psychological distress is that psychological distress, we know that it influences the kind of the uptake of or disengagement from life-prolonging interventions such as non-invasive ventilation, which then obviously in turn impacts on things like survival rates. So really, really important that we address psychological distress in people living with MND and their carers. In terms of what we know about longitudinal predictors, so there are loads and loads and loads of studies looking at predictors of psychological distress. The majority of them are what we call cross-sectional studies. They kind of sort of only look at kind of distress at kind of one particular time point. We need kind of evidence from longitudinal predictors. So these are where you might kind of look at a particular factor at baseline and then follow people up, 3, 6, 12 months later to see kind of which factors actually predict later psychological distress. And so from what we know about these studies of longitudinal predictors of psychological distress, quality of life, and caregiver burden, is that there's kind of numerous factors have been identified, but there is a consistent pattern across both people living with MND and with carers with respect to the importance of psychological and social factors. So with factors such as trait mindfulness, and mood, and kind of social factors such as perceived levels of kind of perceived social support and satisfaction with the relationship at baseline, predicting more severe psychological distress, poorer quality of life, and higher levels of caregiver burden at something like 3 to 12 months later in people living with MND or carers. So it kind of really highlights the importance of particularly monitoring things like mood, quality of life, and caregiver burden in those people who kind of sort of, you know, at diagnosis, for example, are experiencing kind of that poorer mood or those lower levels of perceived social support, relationship satisfaction. So given that it's really important that we address psychological distress in kind of those living with and affected by MND, we're kind of going to turn to thinking about what psychological support should actually be offered to help people to manage their psychological well-being. Now, various clinical practice guidelines and recommendations have been published with respect to the management of MND. But all of these guidelines and recommendations, they kind of sort of share one thing in common with respect to psychological support. And that is essentially the lack of guidance that they're able to provide due to the limited evidence base. And I'm going to go on to that limited evidence base in a short while. If we just kind of sort of focus on the NICE clinical guidelines, because these are kind of sort of the most comprehensive ones, and these are published in 2016 and updated in 2019. Essentially, all they're really able to recommend is that the multidisciplinary team should discuss how MND is affecting the person living with MND and their family, and they should also discuss needs. So suggestions for topics to discuss include things like the person, well, the kind of the whole family, the person and the family, the unit, their understanding of MND, kind of how they feel about the diagnosis and the prognosis, so kind of how they're accepting and coping with that kind of diagnosis and prognosis, how MND is affecting people's abilities to do the things that they usually do, to do the things that kind of really important and matter to them. How they're adjusting to the changes to their life and their perception of self that kind of MND brings. How their relationships, their roles, and all those kind of different family dynamics might be changing. How things like MND is affecting their sexuality and intimacy in their relationships. Any concerns they have about kind of other people and themselves, and then also how they want to be involved in things like decision making and future care planning. The NICE clinical guidelines also recommend that people should be given information about sources of emotional and psychological support. So, for example, such as support groups, online forums, helplines, and respite care. They also recommend that people should be referred to specialist services if people need more expert help. So, for example, people should be referred to psychologists within or attached to the MND MDT. But obviously access to that can be very limited, given that psychologists are not routinely part of the MND MDT. They recommend that people can be referred to things like counselling within local palliative care services. But again, for some people, that kind of some people might not feel ready to receive those kind of services within palliative care due to all the kind of the negative connotations associated with that. And obviously people can be referred to things like NHS talking therapies, kind of sort of primary care service. But the difficulty there is A, the long kind of sort of waiting lists, and B, the fact that therapists might not have that, well, might not, almost likely won't have that knowledge and information, experience of MND. And certainly kind of multiple studies showing that kind of therapists having that knowledge about MND is an important prerequisite of therapy that's been highlighted by people living with MND. And finally, the guidelines essentially recommend that services should ensure they meet people's communication needs and offer different ways of meeting their communication needs for obvious reasons. And these kind of recommendations, they're suggested for family families and carers too. But as you can see, the recommendations are very vague, particularly with respect to the kind of what psychological interventions should be offered to those people living with and affected by MND. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, that's because of the limited evidence base that we have. So what is the evidence for psychological interventions for both of these groups? So as you can see from this slide, so a number of studies, I mean, it's not actually that many studies. When you think about the kind of sort of the number of studies that have been like psychological interventions for people living with cancer, etc., there are so many studies that have been published. If we think this is the kind of the number, it still is quite staggering that there are just so few studies that have looked at psychological interventions in people living with MND. And the problem is that the majority of the studies that have been published have been kind of limited by significant methodological issues. So, for example, lack of a control group. And small sample sizes, which means that it's really not surprising that kind of previous systematic reviews and previous clinical guidelines haven't been able to draw any strong conclusions with respect to what psychological support should be offered. There are two studies that offer a kind of more promise, and these were published since the NICE guidelines were written. One was an RCT of 8-week meditation training compared to treatment as usual. And this study essentially showed that quality of life, depression, and anxiety remained stable across time in the kind of the meditation group. So that's the darker line, but they got worse in the usual care group. So that's the lighter line. While this looks really promising, the problem is the actual, it's really limited by the high attrition rates. So as you can see, kind of sort of from these figures in the table, by 6 months, 50% of people had dropped out. And by 12 months, 71% of participants had dropped out. And again, you can't really draw strong conclusions when you're missing so many people from that evaluation. So the best evidence to date for what psychological support should be offered to people living with MND comes from the COMMEND trial, which examined acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, as we like to shorten it, for people living with MND. So the COMMEND trial, it was part of a kind of a wider 3-phase project that was funded by the NIHR and the MND Association. In that first phase of the project, so this is the COMMEND project, kind of which I led on. So we started off by conducting qualitative interviews with people living with MND, with caregivers, and with healthcare professionals. And essentially, we wanted to be able to explore what psychological interventions kind of should look like for people living with MND, and kind of how we should adapt ACT for this population. And we used these findings to develop an intervention based on ACT that was tailored to the needs of people living with MND. We then tested out the acceptability and the feasibility of our intervention in a small, uncontrolled feasibility study. We only had 29 people in the study. And we showed that kind of ACT is acceptable to this population, and it's feasible to conduct this kind of study. And we showed that kind of ACT, it might be helpful for helping people to maintain their psychological well-being across time. But we couldn't draw any strong conclusions again, because obviously we didn't have a control group and it was a very tiny sample size. And so that's why we conducted a larger randomized controlled trial, which was led by myself and Chris McDermott at the University of Sheffield. And I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about this RCT. So in terms of what we did in the RCT, we recruited people with a diagnosis of ALS, PMA, or PLS. And importantly, we recruited people irrespective of whether they're experiencing psychological distress. We recruited people from 16 MND care centres and clinics across the UK, so England, Scotland, Wales, and via self-referral. And people were chosen at random to either have so up to 8 sessions of acceptance and commitment therapy, plus usual care or usual care alone, and sessions were in person or via video call in order to be able to make them as accessible as possible. In terms of what ACT actually is, so ACT is what we call a third wave psychological therapy. And just to kind of put this in some context with other therapies. So the first wave of psychological therapies are very much focused on changing our behaviour. The second wave of psychological therapies, so things like cognitive behavioural therapy, which I'm sure a lot of people will have heard of, these kind of therapies are focused on changing the content, form, or frequency of our thoughts and our feelings, kind of sort of what our kind of thoughts look like and how often they occur, for example. Now, in contrast, the third wave of therapies are focused on changing how we relate to things like our thoughts and our feelings, rather than trying to change the thoughts and feelings themselves. So it's really focused on changing our relationship to our thoughts and feelings. And ACT is one of these third wave therapies. Things like mindfulness meditation training, one of these third wave therapies too. In terms of what ACT actually is, so ACT's what we call an acceptance-based behavioural therapy that uses a combination of mindfulness and acceptance-based strategies in conjunction with motivation and behavioural change strategies to help people to, first of all, clarify what's really important, what matters to them, what they want to be doing, the type of person they want to be alongside the difficulties they're experiencing. And it aims to help people to learn skills for handling the difficult thoughts and feelings and situations that get in the way of that. Now, an important point about ACT is that it's not aimed at symptomatic reduction, but we do see that happening in therapy as a kind of a byproduct of people kind of being able to do more of things that allow them to be the kind of type of person they want to be. So it's not aimed at symptomatic reduction. Instead, it's kind of focused on helping people to live their lives in ways that are important and kind of meaningful to them, alongside whatever difficulties they might be experiencing that are outside of their control, such as MND. So this notion is sort of kind of letting go of the uncontrollable, letting go of the uncontrollable. Coming back to the RCT, in terms of outcomes, the main thing we were interested in was quality of life, using the McGill Quality of Life questionnaire, but we were also interested in a range of other things, including anxiety and depression, and looking at the costs as well. And we were also interested in how satisfied people found the therapy as well. So what do we find? So in terms of our primary outcome, we found that ACT plus usual care was superior to usual care alone for maintaining or improving quality of life in people living with MND at 6 months. And this is after adjusting for age, sex, and baseline scores. And the pattern results was essentially this kind of small increase in quality of life in the ACT plus usual care arm. So that's the kind of the blue line. And this is combined with a decline in quality of life in the usual care alone arm. So that's the orange line. And that beneficial effect at 6 months was kind of maintained at 9 months. And importantly, thinking about the meditation training trial, where they had attrition rates around sort of 56% at 6 months. So we had an attrition rate of 19%. So 81% of participants completed the outcome measures at 6 months. So it actually kind of sort of, it gives us much more confidence in our findings. We also found that ACT plus usual care was superior to usual care alone for on the psychological and the existential subscales of the McGill Quality of Life questionnaire at both 6 and 9 months, for depression at 6 and 9 months, for psychological inflexibility, which is what ACT aims to improve. That was at 9 months, and then a single item health status measure at 6 months. It's all very well to kind of sort of show the statistical significance of results, but in clinical meaningfulness, it's important to consider that too. Now, no minimal clinically important difference has been reported for the MQOL-R, but our effect sizes of 0.46 and 0.53 standard deviations, they not only exceeded our predefined clinically meaningful effect size. So we had a kind of predefined clinically meaningful effect size of 0.44 standard deviations. That was based on a previous meta-analysis of ACT for mental health and physical health conditions. So our effect sizes kind of exceeded that, but then they were also on kind of, they were consistent with a kind of universally reported effect size of 0.5 standard deviations for quality of life in clinical populations. In terms of other results, we found further evidence to support the acceptability of ACT for people living with MND. So our attendance rates were high, and our satisfaction rates were high as well. And we also found that ACT was cost effective in a subgroup of people experiencing a medium rate of deterioration. So in summary, we showed good evidence that ACT adapted for the needs of people living with MND can help people to manage their quality of life and their psychological well-being. And these findings really highlight the importance of ensuring that people living with MND have access to psychological support, as noted in this the Lancet editorial that was published in June. Turning now to the evidence for psychological interventions for carers of people living with MND. So as you can see from this slide, again, kind of various different studies have been published over the years, and you've got kind of like the more psychologist-led interventions that are on the left, and then you've got the more sort of psychosocial, sort of social support interventions that are on the right. But once again, the majority of studies are limited by the lack of a control group and the small sample size. So again, we just can't draw strong conclusions here because of those significant limitations. There are only 2 studies that are kind of really adequately powered and of sufficiently high quality. And the first was an RCT of a blended ACT-based psychosocial support intervention compared to waitlist control. So in this RCT, they recruited 148 partners of people living with ALS or PMA. And people were, a study was conducted in the Netherlands, and they so recruited people kind of via the database and websites there. And people were chosen at random to either have this what we call blended ACT-based kind of sort of intervention plus usual care, or kind of waitlist control plus usual care. The ACT-based intervention, what it comprised of, when we say blended, it's basically a mixture of some kind of sort of support from a psychologist combined with online kind of modules. So people had one face-to-face session, a telephone support session, and then they had 6 online modules that were guided by a psychologist. And each online module took about an hour and a half to complete. So it's kind of sort of quite a big component of kind of work there. The main thing they were interested in was depression and anxiety at 6 months. But they were also interested in things like quality of life and mood in the person living with MND, and then caregiver burden. And they looked at some other measures as well. Unfortunately, they only found a significant between-group difference on what they called an intervening measure of the ability to kind of sort of control distressing thoughts about caregiving. And the reason they thought this might have been the case was because actually only half of the carers completed the online program. So kind of obviously that's going to influence the results if you only got half the people actually doing the intervention. The other adequately powered study was a cluster RCT of case management compared to usual care. A cluster RCT was so it involved kind of 31 ALS teams in the Netherlands, and they recruited 132 people living with ALS and 126 carers. So again, big study. So as I mentioned, recruited in the Netherlands, and because it's a cluster RCT, so the clusters were essentially the ALS teams, because they didn't want people, they didn't want the intervention being contaminated by, professionals in the same team, kind of one person being in the usual care and one person being in the intervention arm. They didn't want that to be contaminated. So teams were chosen at random to either have case management plus usual care or usual care alone. Case management essentially comprised an occupational therapist visiting every 3 months and really kind of being able to kind of discuss the caregiver's needs. So in terms of things like emotional support, in terms of communicating issues kind of with the ALS team, in terms of helping to negotiate discussions with other kind of sort of third sector services, all those kind of sort of case management type things. And the main thing they were interested in was the emotional functioning in the person with ALS. But they also looked at things like caregiver burden and disease progression. Unfortunately, in this study, they reported no significant between group differences on any primary or secondary outcome measure, which was a real shame. It's a kind of massive study. So essentially showing that there's no additive benefit of case management to kind of multidisciplinary ALS care. Now, this might partly be due to the outcome measures they kind of chose here, because actually what they found was that the case managers were mostly providing emotional support, and they were kind of providing people with information about things like emotional well-being. But of course, there are no measures here of caregivers' emotional kind of well-being. So that might be part of it, but it also might be that actually what the ALS teams kind of providing such fantastic support as it is, that actually this additional case management kind of doesn't have that additive benefit. So at the moment, there's really insufficient evidence for us to be able to recommend any psychological or psychosocial intervention for caregivers. So in summary, kind of what this all shows is, we know that kind of sort of depression and anxiety, they're relatively common in people living with MND and in carers. We know that psychological distress is associated with all those range of negative outcomes, and therefore it's really important that we actually address this. We know that there are psychological and social factors that are important longitudinal predictors of distress, quality of life, caregiver burden, and that things like mood and social support being common to both people living with MND and carers, and really highlights the importance of being able to kind of to monitor these, particularly pay attention to people that are having these difficulties initially, that have those lower levels of perceived social support, because then you know that potentially they're going to kind of experience more psychological distress and therefore going to need more of that support later on. We know that the evidence base is lacking with respect to what psychological support should be offered to people living with MND and their carers, but the best evidence to date is that ACT should be offered to people, based on that. We know that ACT's effective for helping people to maintain and improve their psychological well-being and quality of life. But unfortunately, we just don't have that sufficient evidence at the moment to recommend anything for caregivers. In terms of those research implications, so the COMMEND trial, it was the first adequately powered RCT of any psychological intervention for people living with MND, but clearly we need many more adequately powered, high quality RCTs of psychological interventions for those living with and affected by MND. So with this in mind, what I would definitely recommend is looking out over the next few years for these 2 larger scale RCTs that are kind of in progress. So the first is an RCT of a kind of 3-week online mindfulness course, followed by kind of sort of a 1-month social community kind of online interaction. And that's for people with MND and caregivers. So they're aiming to recruit 150, so aiming to recruit in total 300 people. So that's going to be a really good, high quality RCT with those kind of numbers, hopefully. And they're going to be mainly looking at quality of life. And also keep an eye out for an RCT of a 12-week virtual peer-to-peer support programme compared to usual care, where they're aiming to recruit 160 caregivers of people living with MND, and they're looking at the effect of the intervention on anxiety and depression. So as I was mentioning in that case management, they didn't look at anxiety and depression in carers, and really should. In terms of clinical implications, what all this kind of sort of really highlights is that we need to be regularly screening for depression and anxiety, for kind of psychological distress in both people living with MND and with carers, and using suitable measures that, say for example, that aren't confounded by physical symptoms of MND. We need to be regularly kind of assessing and reassessing people's psychological needs. We need to keep inquiring about these, because people's needs changing across the disease course. And as I mentioned, particularly paying attention to those people who have those lower levels of perceived social support and that kind of sort of lower mood, because we know that those factors predict later psychological distress, quality of life, caregiver burden, etc. We need to be regularly reminding people about what sources of support are available should they need them, so that people kind of sort of don't feel isolated or abandoned. It's obviously it's easy to forget kind of sort of the different types of things that are available. So regularly reminding people so that they don't feel that sense of kind of sort of isolation. We need to be able to adapt the kind of support, obviously, that we provide across the disease course. Somebody might kind of sort of turn down psychological support at one point, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they shouldn't be asked at a later point as their needs change. So we just kind of need to be very flexible around that. And then obviously we can potentially should be offering ACT and potentially mindfulness. There's a kind of that preliminary evidence that mindfulness, essentially these third wave psychological therapies that are kind of helpful for people living with MND. So before we finish, I'd just like to touch on some resources that you might find helpful. So there are information sheets on emotional and psychological support that have been published by the MND Association for people living with MND and carers. And people can also listen to other people's experiences of living with MND by going to things like the Health Talk website. This can be very helpful for really kind of normalizing and validating how people are feeling and what they're experiencing. There's a guide on psychological well-being in people living with MND and carers. It's been written for psychologists, but actually I think it's kind of sort of, there's so many gems in it. It's really kind of a great read. So do recommend that for kind of yourselves to read as well. And then there are some MND Association webinars on psychological care, psychological support, and anticipatory grief that are being given by Rachel Woolrich, Emily Maybury, and Carol Bradley. So these are all available on YouTube, and highly recommend watching these webinars too. And then finally, there are a couple of resources that are highlighted that you kind of taking care of yourself, given the kind of managing those levels of kind of sort of distress. It takes a burden on yourself as well. So there's a webinar on avoiding burnout that Emily Maybury and Sian Hocking gave, and there's also a free stress management guide. It's based on ACT principles that's actually been published by the World Health Organization. So that's a kind of sort of a great little guide to kind of to look at. If you're interested in finding a little bit more about ACT, then there's some great videos that the Veterans Health Administration in the US have published. And if you're interested in finding about the Commend project, then the DOIs kind of all listed here, and they're all kind of available for free. Because I've been talking about the Commend project, I just want to be able to acknowledge and kind of give our thanks to all the people that are involved, including the participants and therapists, the trial team, so Ben Thompson, the trial manager, and Chris McDermott, the co-lead of the RCT, and then the funders, the NIHR and the MND Association. Okay, so thank you for listening, and I hope you found some of what I've said today interesting.
Becky, thank you very much, and on time, beautifully done. I can see that there are no questions at the moment. I do have one before we go into break. I think you already said it's very rare that there is a psychologist as part of the team. I think you laid the groundwork very much to say there should be.
Yeah.
How do we do that? How do we collectively do that to ensure that that can happen?
Yeah, well, so they're kind of sort of a multi-pronged strategy. So certainly one of the things we've been doing is working with the MND Association about kind of ensuring that more people have access to psychological therapy. So they're kind of sort of got various projects kind of going on at the moment that's exploring trying to increase that access. We're also fighting their hardest to try and get this in the NICE guidelines. So I just want the NICE guidelines to look at the Lancet editorial, thank you very much, and kind of stick Commend in there, because of course, if then there's something recommended, then that obviously kind of sort of provides kind of a reason, more reason as to why we should be kind of having psychologists either in the MDT or kind of attached to it, preferably in the MDT rather than attached to it, because of the kind of sort of the crucial role that psychologists can play.